Hi friends, it's Ryan Hembree here, and this video is all about the Gospel of Mark, specifically about its authorship and authenticity. And this is a really important discussion because in recent history, it's become common to reject the long-held tradition that John Mark penned this Gospel. And if Mark wasn't written by Mark, who was the Apostle Peter's interpreter, but was written by someone pretending to be him hundreds of years later, well, then it can't be an eyewitness account, can it? In fact, it would be nothing more than a forgery and could not be trusted as an authentic account of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. But is the skeptic's position supported by the evidence, or do the facts support the traditional belief that Mark was indeed the author? Well, grab your Bible, dust it off if you have to, and let's investigate. The Gospel of Mark, though coming after Matthew, was probably the first of the four Gospels to be written. And as the title of the book indicates, it's John Mark's account of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. But besides the title, how do we know that Mark really wrote this Gospel? Well, determining the authorship for New Testament books comes from three lines of evidence. First, many of the books include an introduction with the author's name. Second, early and long-held tradition identify the author. And third, internal evidence. Now, although none of the Gospels identify the name of its author within its text, early church tradition accepted without question the current names ascribed to them. And significantly, no other names have ever been attached to these Gospels, and Mark is no exception. As a matter of fact, the early church fathers universally and repeatedly identified Mark as the writer, and that as Peter's associate, his account was really a record of Peter's eyewitness observations. Papias, for example, wrote that Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. Similarly, Irenaeus, who was a student of Ignatius, and Polycarp, who were both students of the Apostle John, said that Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. But despite this long-held tradition, as Detective Warner Wallace writes in his book Cold Case Christianity, it's been fashionable recently to question the authenticity of the Gospels and the claims of the early church fathers related to their authorship. Were the Gospels intentionally misattributed to the apostles or their associates? Was there a conspiracy of some sort to make the Gospels seem authoritative? Well, to answer these questions, Wallace has applied to the Gospels the very same methods he's used to crack countless homicide cases. And significantly, his investigation revealed that the internal textual evidence does support the claims of the early church. Regarding Mark's Gospel, for example, he documented several Peter-related features in the text which make sense if Peter was Mark's source of information. And let me just share with you some of his discoveries. First, notice that Peter takes prominence in Mark's Gospel, as he's mentioned more frequently than in the other Gospels, 26 times in only 16 chapters in fact. Also, Mark seems more familiar with Peter, as he never refers to him by his formal name, Simon Peter, as the other Gospel writers do. He only ever calls him Simon or Peter, the briefest and most familiar versions of his name. Mark also seemed to respect Peter more than any other Gospel writer did, as he repeatedly painted Peter in the kindest possible way, even when Peter made a fool of himself. Matthew's Gospel, for example, describes Jesus walking on water and Peter's failed attempt to do the same. In Matthew's account, Peter began to sink into the sea, and Jesus described him as a doubter and a man of little faith. Interestingly, Mark respectfully omitted Peter's involvement altogether. So again and again, Mark protects Peter from embarrassment. Also, Mark and Mark alone included a number of seemingly unimportant details that point to Peter's involvement in the shaping of the text. Mark alone told us that Simon and his companions were the ones who went looking for Jesus when he was praying in a solitary place. Mark is also the only gospel to tell us that it was Peter who first drew Jesus' attention to the withered fig tree. And Mark alone seemed to be able to identify the specific disciples, including Peter, who asked Jesus about the timing of the destruction of the temple. Mark also appears to have followed Peter's practice of omitting details related to Jesus' private life. Whenever Peter preached about Jesus, in Acts for example, he limited his descriptions to Jesus' public life, death, resurrection, and ascension. Mark also followed this rough outline, omitting the birth narrative and other details of Jesus' private life that are found in Luke's and Matthew's Gospels. And another thing Wallace points out is how Mark used Peter as a set of bookends. Unlike in other Gospel accounts, Peter is the first disciple identified in the text and also the last disciple mentioned in the text. And scholars describe this type of bookending as inclusio and have noticed it in other ancient texts where a piece of history is attributed to a particular eyewitness. Hence, textual analysis supports the early church's conviction that Mark is the author and that his gospel is indeed the eyewitness testimony of Peter. All right, guys, that's it for this one, but I want to encourage you to read Mark's gospel for yourself and take note of all the Peter-related features. All evidence points to Mark as author and hence as an eyewitness account of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. And this video was just a very brief introduction, but if you want to go really in depth into Mark's gospel and all the gospels, then I highly recommend Detective Warner Wallace's book, Cold Case Christianity. As I said earlier, he applied the same principles he's used to solve several homicide cases to the Gospels. This once hardened skeptic and atheist became convinced by the evidence that the Gospels are truly authentic and trustworthy eyewitness accounts. As Jesus himself said, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free."